The wind always came from the north on the day they left her. It wasn't a storming wind, not the kind that knocked signs loose or tore shutters from hinges. No, it was softer, mean in its subtlety, dry as ash and full of whispers. It carried the smell of iron and horses, the final exhale of a wagon fading into the wilds, and the sound of a girl's breath caught in her throat as she watched it go. She stood barefoot on the edge of Dry Creek's dust-bitten outskirts, where the land flattened into nothing but sagebrush and memory. 11 summers old maybe, though no one could say for sure. Her dress had once been yellow but now clung to her frame in the same shade as the dirt under her heels. One braid had come undone, letting a tangle of hair whip across her cheek. She didn't flinch. No name was spoken for her. Not by those who passed her on the road. Not by the preacher who'd once offered her bread in silence. She was simply the orphan, the girl who'd stayed when her family didn't. She learned quickly that silence was safer than begging, and wandering was better than waiting. They'd gone west, her kin, chasing gold or land or something more slippery. They hadn't told her they were leaving. Maybe they couldn't look her in the eyes and say it. Maybe they had, and she just refused to hear it. She lived in an abandoned sod house tucked behind a rise of brittle cottonwoods, half buried, like a forgotten grave. It kept out most of the rain and some of the cold. She kept a cracked bowl for collecting dew, and a knife with a handle worn smooth as riverstone. Most nights were a sort of waiting for nothing, for days to pass, for the sun to die, down behind the hills and the stars to scatter like broken glass. Hunger came and went, sometimes worse, sometimes gentler, like an old ache in the bones. She got used to the quiet, the kind that wraps around you like burlap, rough and close and hard to shake. It was on one such evening when the light stretched long and the wind whistled low that she heard the whimpering. She almost missed it. A faint, pitiful sound. No, louder than the creak of dry wood or the sigh of wind through grass, but it tugged at her in a way she didn't understand. She followed it past the old wagon road, through the scrub brush, to the skeletal remains of a once grand wagon tipped, on its side like a dead horse. Beneath it, tucked between rusted spokes and a sagging axle, were 2 pups, skin and bone with eyes too big for their heads. One was sandy-colored, the other dark like river mud. They didn't bark or growl, just watched her, silent and trembling. She knelt without speaking, letting the quiet stretch out. She pulled the heel of bread from her pocket, already hard from a day in the sun. She broke it in thirds, placing each piece carefully on the ground before nudging it forward with her fingers. The pups sniffed. The darker one crept forward first, then the other followed. They ate without sound. She didn't smile, hadn't in some time, but something loosened in her chest. Something warm and wordless. That night, they followed her, home. No leash, no call. Just 3 creatures who knew what it meant to be unwanted. She didn't name them, not right away. It felt like a promise, and promises had teeth. But days passed, then weeks, and still they stayed. The dark one watched, the horizon like a sentry, always alert. The sandy one leaned against her thigh when she sat, warm and solid. She named them Dusty and Copper, soft syllables she spoke only to the wind. The town noticed. Of course it did. Dry Creek didn't miss much, especially when it came to those who lived outside the lines. Miss Luella May, with her stiff curls and sharper tongue, saw the pups trailing the orphan one morning and said, loud enough for the general store to hear, "Can't feed herself, but she's got mouths to feed now. Mark my words, those dogs'll turn savage." Others echoed her, murmurs like mosquitoes. Sheriff Emmett Graves rode by the edge of her field one dusk, reining his horse to a halt, just long enough to stare. He didn't speak, just gave a slow shake of his head before trotting on. The girl said nothing. She never did. But that night she laid flat in the grass beside her sod house and watched the stars burn. Dusty curled at her feet, Copper against her ribs. She closed her eyes and felt the shape of their breathing, and for the first time in her memory, the silence did not feel so lonely. Eli Mercer saw her once. He was 16, tall and awkward, always, smelling faintly of horse sweat and smoke. He worked the stables behind the saloon, mostly invisible. But he saw her, crossing the field with Dusty at her heel and Copper loping ahead like a scout. She didn't look up. He didn't wave. But something passed between them. A stillness. He didn't tell anyone he'd seen her. That mattered more than she could say. Then came the day she stood outside the blacksmith's, trading a snare trap for a handful of nails and a tin cup. Dusty and Copper waited a few feet back, wary but calm. A boy, small and mean-eyed, threw a stone at Copper's flank. The pup yelped, startled, then growled low in his throat. "See?" said the boy. "Told you they're wild." Sheriff Graves stepped from the saloon just then, his eyes catching the tail end of the moment. He frowned, scratched his jaw, and said, "Girl, if those dogs go biting someone, they'll be put down. You understand?" She didn't answer, just gathered her things and walked away, but her cheeks burned long after, and that night she ran her fingers over Copper's fur with trembling hands. That was the way of Dry Creek. No fists, no fury, just slow suffocation by way of stares and sideways words. Still, she endured. Because endurance was what she had. Endurance and 2 sets of paw prints trailing her in the dust. One evening, months later, she found a feather at her doorstep. Hawk feather. Clean. Left, purposefully. She picked it up, looked to the horizon, and saw no one. But she kept the feather. She tied it to a string and placed it above the pup's sleeping space where it danced when the wind came. Dusty wagged his tail in approval. Copper rested his chin on her boot, and for the first time since the wagons left and the silence came, she whispered a word aloud into the twilight. "Stay." They did. Winter came hard to Dry Creek that year, hard and early, like it had something to prove. The kind of cold that didn't ask permission, just showed up in the night and stayed until everything soft had stiffened and cracked. The earth turned, brittle beneath frostbitten sage, and the wind carried less dust and more bite. Chimneys smoked like tired lungs, and even the cattle grew quieter, standing in groups like they too had decided speaking wasn't worth the effort anymore. She was 15 by then. Her body had lengthened, limbs sharp with hunger, cheekbones shadowed by the absence of fat. But her eyes had grown stiller, like deep water that didn't want to be disturbed. Copper was full-grown, a tawny beast of patience and loyalty, still, silent except when shadows passed too near. He slept close enough to feel her breath at night rising and falling with hers, steady as a drumbeat, no one else heard. Dusty aged faster. His joints creaked on cold mornings. He'd begun to limp on his front leg, though he bore it with quiet dignity. He no longer chased birds or darted through brush. Instead, he stayed near her side, watching the horizon like something out there might one day call him home. They were a trio carved from the same forgotten wood, worn but enduring. She had begun trapping small game to trade. Rabbits mostly, sometimes a muskrat if the stream hadn't frozen too solid. She learned how to set the snares just right, how to skin and stretch, how to smile thinly when handing over pelts to a man who wouldn't meet her eyes. The trapper gave her jerky in return, hard and peppered, and she divided it between herself and the dogs. One morning, she returned to the cedar tree at the edge of her land and found Dusty still. He wasn't sleeping, she knew it at once. His eyes were open, glassed over, and his body was curved gently like he'd laid down to rest but never got up again. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She sat beside him in the frost, her fingers in his fur, and stayed there until the sun dipped low behind the ridge. Copper sat close, pressing into her side, his eyes unreadable. When the ground was too frozen to dig, she waited. 2 days later, the thaw came just long enough. She buried Dusty beneath the cedar, wrapping him in the cloth that had once been her mother's shawl, faded blue, frayed at the ends. The act felt too small for the love he'd given, but it was what she had. After the grave was filled, she sat, cross-legged in front of it, the cold sinking into her bones. That was when Eli Mercer came. He didn't announce himself, just appeared like he'd stepped out of the wind. He was taller than she remembered, his shoulders broader beneath a coat patched in places where a careful hand had tried and failed to make it whole again. His face was sharp from work and winter, but his eyes held the same quiet that hers did. He carried a wooden-handled shovel slung over his shoulder and said nothing for a while. When he finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "I brought this, in case you needed help." She nodded. That was enough. He knelt beside the grave, resting, the shovel gently on the dirt, and together they added stones to the top, slow and solemn. She noticed he'd brought wildflowers, too. Winter bloom, brittle but bright. He placed them down without ceremony. They didn't talk about Dusty. They didn't have to. When he stood to go, she reached into her coat and pulled out the carved charm she'd been shaping, an acorn hollowed through the center, threaded on a piece of sinew. She pressed it into his hand. "For you," she said, her voice scratchy from disuse. He looked surprised but didn't speak, just nodded and walked away, the charm swinging lightly between his fingers. The town still watched her with the same mixture of suspicion and dismissal. Miss Luella May leaned harder into her gossip, now accusing the girl of raising wolves and speaking to ghosts. "Talks to no one but her dogs," she muttered. "What kind of girl does that?" The sheriff kept his eye on her whenever she came into town. He never said much, but his gaze followed her the way a hawk watches mice. She didn't flinch under it anymore, not because it didn't hurt, but because she'd decided their stares didn't matter more than her survival. Copper took on the silence, Dusty left behind, shadowing her movements with a seriousness he hadn't shown before. He would lie beside Dusty's grave sometimes, head bowed low, eyes closed like in prayer. She would sit beside him, her fingers brushing the soil as if feeling for something beneath. Eli returned now and again, never with warning, sometimes with food, sometimes with a coil of rope or a jar of honey. He left them near the cedar, always wrapped carefully in cloth. She left things too, feathers, small carvings, a strip of leather shaped like a leaf. It became their way of speaking. One evening, she came to the cedar and found him there, waiting, not moving toward her, not away. She stopped a few feet from him. Copper sat beside her like a sentinel. Eli held something behind his back. When he showed it, it was a carving of his own. Rough, clumsy, but unmistakably her. Her silhouette, standing with the dog at her side, both facing into the wind. She stared at it for a long moment, then looked at him. He didn't smile, but his eyes warmed. "I didn't know how else to say thank you," he murmured. She stepped forward and took it from his hand. For a brief moment, their fingers touched. No sparks, no grand swelling of music, just warmth. And for her, that was more than enough. They stood there a while, not speaking. The wind moved around them like breath, and the cedar tree shivered overhead. The sky turned a bruised violet, and stars began to blink into being. Eventually, she turned to go. He didn't follow, but she knew he would return, and that was a comfort she hadn't known she missed. That night, she held the carving close before tucking it into the folds of her bedding. Copper curled at her feet. The wind outside sang a different song now, less mournful, more like a promise. When she slept, it was deep and dreamless. By the time the sun rose, she was already outside, setting traps with practiced hands, the frost crunching beneath her boots. She didn't look back at the cedar. She didn't need to. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the faintest trace of smoke. She stood at the edge of her world, where the prairie met the sky, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if searching for something she couldn't name. Copper sat beside her. His ears perked, sensing the change in the air. The days had grown longer, the sun lingering in the sky as if reluctant to set. She spent her mornings tending to the small garden she'd coaxed from the stubborn earth. Her fingers, calloused from work. The vegetables grew slowly, but they grew, a testament to her patience and care. Eli's visits became more frequent, though still unannounced. He brought with him small gifts, a spool of thread, a tin of tea, a book with pages yellowed by time. They sat together in comfortable silence, the words between them few but meaningful. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, he handed her a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a sketch of the sod house, the garden, and the cedar tree. In the corner he had drawn her, standing with Copper at her side. She traced the lines with her finger, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He shrugged, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. "Just wanted to capture it." They sat together until the stars emerged, the silence between them filled with unspoken understanding. But peace is often fleeting. One morning she awoke to find Copper missing. Panic surged through her as she searched the surrounding fields, calling his name. Hours passed before she found him near the edge of town, his leg caught in a trap. Blood stained his fur, and his eyes were filled with pain. Gizmo. She freed him carefully, tears streaming down her face as she carried him back to the sod house. She tended to his wounds, her hands shaking, her heart heavy with guilt. Word spread quickly through Dry Creek. Whispers turned to accusations, and soon the sheriff arrived at her door. He stood tall, his expression stern. "There's talk of your dog attacking livestock," he said. "Some folks want him put down." She met his gaze, her voice steady. "Copper wouldn't harm anyone." He sighed, removing his hat. "I believe you, but the town's restless. Keep him close and keep him out of trouble." She nodded, gratitude and fear mingling in her chest. Eli arrived later that day, his brow furrowed with concern. She told him everything, her voice barely above a whisper. He listened, his jaw clenched. "They don't know him like you do," he said. "We'll find a way to show them." Together they devised a plan. Eli spoke to the townsfolk, sharing stories of Copper's loyalty and gentleness. He invited them to visit the sod house, to see for themselves. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Neighbors came, some out of curiosity, others out of genuine interest. They watched as Copper tended to the garden, his movements careful and deliberate. They saw the bond between the girl and her dog, the quiet understanding that passed between them. Miss Luella May arrived one afternoon, her expression skeptical. She stood at the edge of the garden, arms crossed. "He seems well behaved," she admitted. The girl nodded. "He's my family." Luella's gaze softened. "Perhaps I was too quick to judge." As the days passed, the town's perception shifted. The girl was no longer just the orphan with the wild dog. She became a symbol of resilience, of quiet strength. Eli continued to visit, their bond deepening with each passing day. They shared stories, laughter, and moments of silence that spoke volumes. One evening, as they sat beneath the cedar tree, he reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined, a simple gesture that conveyed more than words ever could. The wind rustled the leaves above them, carrying with it the promise of a new beginning. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her lips. For the first time in years, she felt truly at home. The wind howled that morning like something ancient and wounded, clawing through the brittle grass with a voice that echoed loss. She rose before dawn, bundled in wool and leather, her hands red from the cold. The sky was the pale color of breath before sunrise, and her breath came in sharp clouds. Copper padded silently at her side, his paw finally healed, though his gait bore a permanent limp, a quiet reminder of pain survived. She had become a fixture on the outskirts of Dry Creek now. Still watched, still whispered about, but no longer scorned. Some nodded to her when she passed, awkwardly perhaps, but not unkind. There was a weight in her eyes, a way she held herself, that made folks think twice before speaking above a hush. The girl they had once called a ghost, or worse, now seemed more solid than most of them, stitched into the land as rooted as the cedar. Eli had started leaving sketches behind. More frequent now, more detailed. One of her in the garden, another of copper with his head tilted toward the hills. He never left them with a note, just the drawing itself, folded carefully and placed inside the hollow of the fence post where they always exchanged things. It was their language now. Images, gestures, things left unsaid and yet fully understood. It had been 3 weeks since she'd seen him in person. She didn't question it aloud. That wasn't her way. But a gnawing unease had begun to make a home in her ribs. He wouldn't have stayed away without reason. And so, that morning, she made her way into town. Not to trade, not to skirt the edges and slip back unnoticed, but with her boots firm on the ground and purpose in her stride. Dry Creek was quiet under a thick sky. The general store's bell rang softly when she entered. Mr. Billings looked up, startled, then offered a nod that nearly passed for warmth. She asked about Eli. He shrugged, said he hadn't seen the boy since before the last storm rolled in. She asked at the smithy, at the livery. Even stopped by the church and peered into the dim interior where only candle wax and silence answered her. No one had seen him. No one knew anything. It was Miss Luella May who pulled her aside just as she was leaving town, her voice low and her perfume too sweet. I saw Sheriff Klein ride out to Eli's last week. Looked serious. Might be nothing, but I'd check the old mining trail if I were you. She didn't thank her, but she didn't ignore her either. The mining trail wound up into the hills, half forgotten and mostly washed out, leading toward what remained of the Mercer family's land. Eli's parents had been gone since the drought. Drove them off years ago, but he'd stayed. She knew the trail, had walked part of it once with Dusty before the dog grew too tired and they turned back. It wasn't safe. Landslides were common, and wolves had been spotted near the higher ridges. Still, she went, with Copper beside her and a satchel packed with bread, water, and a knife. By midday, the clouds had thickened, and snow fell in fine, sifting flakes. The trail was narrow and hard, winding between rocks and brittle brush. Birds didn't sing here. Even Copper seemed uneasy, his ears flicking, his movements tense. She found the cabin after hours of walking. It was slumped into the earth like something too tired to keep standing. Smoke rose weakly from the crooked chimney. She knocked once. The door opened slowly. Eli stood there, face pale, one hand gripping the frame to steady himself. His other arm was bound in a makeshift sling, the sleeve stained deep with blood. I was coming back, he said, voice hoarse. She stepped inside without waiting for more, Copper following silently. The interior was sparse: bed, stove, a stack of chopped wood, some sketches strewn across the table. She helped him sit, unwrapped the sling, saw the deep gash along his upper arm, poorly stitched. A trap, he muttered. I was checking for a neighbor. Got careless. She cleaned the wound with what little water he had left, tore strips from her own shirt to rebind it. Her hands moved with care, but her jaw stayed tight. When he flinched, she didn't apologize. Instead, she said, "You should have come to me." His eyes flicked to hers. "Didn't want to worry you." Her fingers paused. Too late. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Snow fell heavier now, thick and fast. She stayed that night, tending the stove and coaxing soup from jerky and beans. He dozed in and out, fever brightening his cheeks. She sat beside him, wrapped in a blanket, watching the fire. Copper lay across the threshold like a guardian. In the flickering light, she studied Eli's face. He looked younger somehow in sleep, his brow relaxed, his mouth softer. A boy carved by solitude and resilience, like her. When he stirred, his hand brushed hers, and this time she didn't pull away. In the morning, the storm had worsened. The path home would be too dangerous now, and they both knew it. So they waited. 2 days, then 3. The cabin became a world unto itself. They spoke little, but when they did, it mattered. She told him about Dusty's last day. He told her about his father's silence, the way it could feel louder than rage. She carved a new charm while he slept, a bird with its wings open. She left it on the windowsill. He saw it the next morning and didn't say anything, but he tucked it into his pocket and kept his hand there all day. On the fourth day, the storm broke. Sky returned in fractured blue pieces, and light spilled across the mountains like grace. They left at dawn, Eli slower but upright. She walked ahead, checking the trail, carving notches in the bark to mark their way. Copper moved with careful urgency as if he too sensed that something was coming, and something was. Halfway down the trail they heard it, voices, rough and urgent, not far off. Then a shot cracked the silence like thunder. Eli shoved her behind. A rock, teeth clenched. "Poachers," he whispered. "They've been hunting near here. Sheriff tried to stop them. They don't like witnesses." They crouched low, heartbeats wild things inside their chests. Another shot rang out. Then a shout, someone crying for help. Eli started to rise. She grabbed his arm. "No, you're not strong enough." But he looked at her with a steadiness that went all the way down to his bones. "I have to try." She nodded, took the knife from her satchel. "Then we go together." They moved like shadows through the trees, Copper flanking them. The poachers had cornered a deputy, young, bleeding, his horse dead nearby. One man held a rifle, the other laughed, a sound empty of warmth. It happened fast. Eli stepped into view, drawing their attention. The man with the rifle aimed, shouted something she didn't catch. She came in from the side, knife flashing. Copper lunged low, teeth bared. The fight was brief, brutal. One man fled. The other lay on the ground, groaning, his weapon kicked far. Eli staggered, clutching his side. The deputy looked up at them as if seeing ghosts. "Thought I was done," he breathed. They helped him stand, wrapped his arm, took turns leading the way back down. The town was waiting when they arrived, drawn by the echo of gunfire, by fear, by curiosity. And when they saw her, steady beneath Eli's arm, Copper walking tall beside them, they saw more than an orphaned girl. They saw the truth of her. Sheriff Klein took their story, his face grave. "You saved a man's life today," he said. "Both of you." She didn't answer, just nodded and stepped back into the snow, her face unreadable. That night, she sat outside the sod house, staring up at the stars. Eli was inside, resting. Copper lay beside her, warm against the chill. The sky was endless again. She let the silence settle, heavy but kind. Something had shifted in her. Not loudly, not with fire, but like a river changing course, slow and unstoppable. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was becoming. The dawn stretched thin, fragile as spun glass, barely holding the weight of the coming day. She stood barefoot at the edge of the prairie, toes curling into the cold earth, feeling the first breath of morning dew cool against her skin. Copper sat quietly beside her, a shadow at her side, his eyes alert yet softened by the growing light. The dog's limp was less pronounced now, but she never forgot the jagged memory beneath his steady gait, the price of survival. The world felt heavy and light all at once, like the pause between heartbeats, waiting for something to unfold, something she didn't yet have words for. The air smelled faintly of sage and distant wood smoke, a scent that pulled at the edges of her soul, weaving threads of both comfort and unease. The sky stretched, pale and endless, as if holding its breath along with her. Life in Dry Creek had settled into a rhythm, slow, deliberate, marked by the seasons and small acts of grace. The townsfolk still cast their cautious glances her way, a mixture of curiosity and old suspicion, but their whispers softened, replaced by quiet nods of recognition. She was no longer the shadow drifting on the outskirts, but a presence rooted, like the cedar that stood stubbornly near her sod house, tall and unyielding against the wind. Her days were shaped by ritual, tending the garden that bloomed stubbornly in the stubborn earth, coaxing life from cracked soil, patching clothes with thread that pulled tight like the fragile seams of her own hope, sharing silent mornings with Copper, whose quiet companionship was a balm for the loneliness she had long carried. Eli's visits grew more frequent, though never planned or boisterous. He came like the soft wind stirring the prairie grass, bringing small gifts, a spool of thread, a tin of tea, a book whose yellowed pages smelled of forgotten stories. They shared moments steeped in quiet understanding, words few but heavy with meaning, each gesture a stitch in the fabric of a connection growing stronger beneath the surface. One evening, as the sun bled low and spilled fire across the western sky, he handed her a folded scrap of paper. She unfolded it with reverence, the rough edges crinkling beneath her fingertips. It was a drawing, delicate and alive, a sketch of her sod house nestled beneath the cedar, Copper sitting faithfully at her side, the garden bursting with stubborn green. In the corner he had drawn her figure strong and steady, eyes full of quiet determination. She traced the lines slowly, the smile that crept across her lips soft as the twilight. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound in the fading light. He shrugged, cheeks flushed with a blush she rarely saw. "Just wanted to capture it," he said, eyes downcast. They sat side by side, watching the stars unravel one by one, the silence between them full of unspoken promises and shared memories. The world felt vast but less lonely when he was near, as if the weight of the past lightened just enough to let them breathe together. But peace, like the prairie wind, is often unpredictable and fleeting. One morning the world shattered quietly. Copper was gone. The sudden absence was a hollow ache, gnawing and sharp. She called for him, voice raw with panic, searching the fields and scrubland that surrounded her home. Hours dragged like heavy stones beneath the sky's cold glare. At last, she found him near the edge of town, caught in a cruel steel trap. Blood matted in his thick fur, eyes wide with pain and fear. Her hands trembled as she worked to free him, the cold bite of the metal sinking deep into her skin. Tears blurred her vision, running hot down her cheeks as she cradled him close, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. The pain in Copper's eyes mirrored the ache in her own heart, a silent testament to battles fought and scars endured. Word spread quickly through Dry Creek, whispers twisting into accusations. Soon the sheriff came knocking at her door, his presence both a warning and a trial. "There's talk of your dog attacking livestock," he said, voice low but firm. "Some folks want him put down." She met his gaze steadily, voice unwavering. "Copper wouldn't harm anyone." He sighed, removing his hat with a slow, deliberate gesture. "I believe you. But the town's restless. Keep him close, keep him out of trouble." The weight of his words settled on her shoulders like a stone, heavy but not breaking. She nodded, gratitude and fear intertwining in her chest. Eli arrived. Later that day, concern knitting his brow as she shared the news. His jaw tightened with anger and frustration, but his voice was calm when he spoke. "They don't know him like you do. We'll find a way to show them." Together, they hatched a plan, quiet and deliberate. Eli spoke at the general store, in the saloon and along dusty streets, weaving stories of Copper's loyalty, his gentle ways and the steadfast bond between the dog and the girl who had saved him long ago. He invited neighbors to visit her sod house, to see Copper in his world, calm and watchful in the garden, patient and tender beneath her hands. Slowly, like dawn creeping over the hills, the tide began to turn. Neighbors came, some out of curiosity, others from a hope to understand. They watched Copper tend the garden with gentle paws, saw the silent conversation between him and the girl, a bond forged in hardship and love. Miss Luella May, always skeptical, came to stand at the garden's edge, arms crossed, eyes sharp. "He seems well behaved," she admitted one afternoon, voice softer than before. "He's my family," the girl said simply, pride threading through the quiet strength in her words. Luella's gaze softened, the barriers built by years of judgment beginning to crumble. "Perhaps I was too quick to judge." In the days that followed, the town's perception shifted. The girl was no longer the orphan with the wild dog, but a symbol of resilience and quiet strength, a reminder that family could be chosen and that home was built with patience and care. Through it all, Eli's visits deepened the bond they shared. Their connection was not forged in grand declarations but in small gestures. A shared cup of tea, a lingering glance, hands brushing as they worked side by side. The slow bloom of something tender, fragile, and real. One evening, beneath the cedar tree whose branches whispered ancient secrets, Eli reached for her hand. She did not pull away. Their fingers intertwined, a simple, sacred gesture that spoke volumes. The wind rustled the leaves above, carrying with it the promise of a new beginning. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a contented sigh slipping past her lips. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of the world ease from her shoulders, but the past was never far behind. A thunderstorm rolled in that night, sudden and fierce. The sky split open with a jagged flash, followed by a roar that shook the earth beneath their feet. Copper growled low in the darkness, restless and uneasy. The next morning the town awoke to a new kind of fear. The sheriff's office was ablaze, smoke choking the air, flames licking hungrily at the wood. The fire was no accident. Someone had set it deliberately. Eli was the first to speak the unspoken. "They want to scare us, to push us out." The whispers grew darker, old suspicions rekindled into threats. She saw it in the hard set of faces, the coldness that had never quite left. But this time she would not retreat. Together with Eli and Copper, she stood before the town at sunset, the sky a blood-red canvas behind them. Her voice was steady, unwavering, carrying the weight of everything she had endured. "I am not afraid," she said, eyes blazing. "This is my home. Copper is my family, and we will not be driven away by fear or hate." The crowd was silent. The moment stretched, taut as a drawn bowstring. Then slowly a few voices rose in agreement, tentative but real. The sheriff stepped forward, nodding solemnly. "We'll find whoever did this, and we'll make sure justice is served." Hope flickered, fragile but alive. That night, as stars pierced the velvet sky, she sat by the fire. Copper curled at her feet, Eli's hand warm in hers. The land around them breathed quiet and steady, a lullaby after the storm. She thought of the 2 starving puppies she had once found, trembling and alone, and the long journey they had taken together, through hunger, fear, and loneliness, toward healing and belonging. Life was a slow river, winding and deep, carrying them forward into the unknown, and she was ready for whatever came next. As you read these words, know this: our lives are often shaped by the quiet battles we fight, the ones unseen by the world but felt deep in our bones. In the face of hardship, it is small acts of courage, the steadfastness of love, and the gentle touch of grace that carve out places where we can finally belong. So when your own night grows long and the road feels lonely, remember the girl and her dog standing firm against the storm. Remember that even in the darkest times, a heart brave enough to hope can light the way home.